Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Neighbors in a quiet block of Buenos Aires said they noticed a sharp chemical alcohol odor before they saw the heat ripple in the glass. One home, one fire. One woman rushed to a burn unit with injuries so severe that the usual words, accident, mishap, stopped sounding plausible. In towns like this, murder isn't just a crime. It tears at the fabric of a quiet community. And yet, tonight, we begin with a single fact no one disputes. A sudden, fast-burning blaze inside a family residence on February 10th, 2010. First units arrived to heavy damage localized to a single room and adjacent corridor. Responders documented rapid ignition consistent with a liquid accelerant. Minimal soot deposition at higher points, pronounced charring at lower splash zones, and a clean edge where heat hadn't traveled beyond the liquid's reach. A container with alcohol residue was photographed and bagged. No secondary scene is alleged in this episode. The residence is the sole locus of the event. The hospital is treatment, not evidence of origin. The victim, 29-year-old Wanda Tade, mother of two, was alive on arrival to the burn center with extensive burns covering an estimated 60% of her body surface area. Stabilization focused on airway control, fluid resuscitation, and infection risk. Clinicians noted patterning more consistent with splash exposure than a static, localized flame. Inside the residence, investigators performed a standard cause and origin sweep. They mapped pour paths, tested for accelerant traces, and photographed burn patterns from several heights for later comparison to the victim's injuries. A preliminary timeline formed. Raised voices reported by neighbors, then the odor, then flame development fast enough to trigger a call for help within minutes. The ignition source remained under review. Multiple items were swabbed, matches, lighters, a stove knob, until lab work could speak. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. When physics and testimony overlap too neatly, investigators ask whether the scene was misunderstood or managed. At the hospital, forensic medical coordination began. Injury distribution matters. Which side shows deeper burns, whether clothing seams shielded skin, and whether inhalation injury indicates flame proximity at face level or later smoke exposure. In this case, the pattern suggested directional liquid contact rather than a single-point flare from a candle or appliance. That narrows mechanisms, not motives. The team also logged treatment intervals, prospective surgeries, and the vital sign trends that would later define legal thresholds, because in homicide work, the moment of death fixes the charge in law, but the mechanism of injury anchors the narrative of what happened. Context added pressure. The spouse present at the address is a public figure, a drummer with a nationally known rock band. Public attention brings heat. It does not prove anything. Interviews were scheduled, statements recorded, and the residence held under seal for re-entry documentation. Investigators emphasized sequence discipline, fix the timeline, preserve the artifacts, let toxicology and burn pattern analysis speak before conclusions travel farther than the facts. No shortcuts, no dramatic leaps, just evidence. If you're following along, focus on the forensic questions that matter. Was the liquid placement consistent with an accidental spill, or did the pattern show intentional application? Did ignition occur at floor level or near the victim's clothing? Were there multiple ignition points, and did any witness report seeing open flame before the shouting, or only after? Our job tonight is not to posture a villain, it's to establish what the scene can and cannot say. This is a real case. People still live with its consequences. Wanda Tade was 29, a mother of two, and by all accounts, reliable in her routines. She kept close ties to her parents and maintained a predictable home schedule built around her children's needs. That matters because homicide investigations start with baselines: who the victim was, what a normal day looked like, and what deviations the evidence shows. The night of February 10th, 2010 was a deviation measured in minutes. Raised voices reported by neighbors, a sudden ignition inside a private residence, and catastrophic injury that demanded immediate transfer to a specialized burn unit in Buenos Aires. At the hospital, the record shifts from fire science to medicine. Intake notes captured an estimated 60% total body surface area burns with involvement requiring airway management. Clinicians prioritized fluid resuscitation under standard protocols to stabilize circulation and prevent early organ stress. The team documented injury depth by region, mapped dressing changes, and photographed key areas for a medical legal packet. That packet was logged with chain of custody forms, so investigators could align treatment imagery with the scene photographs recorded earlier. This step prevents two common problems in court: mislabeling images and confusing pre-debridement patterns with post-surgical appearance. Family arrived within hours. Their role in the case file is factual: identification, consent for procedures, and schedule coordination with detectives who needed accurate personal history. No speculation about relationships is necessary here. The questions were narrow and relevant: medications, recent medical complaints, stressors that might explain behavior, and confirmation of clothing the victim had been wearing before the fire. Investigators requested the clothing remnants, bandage materials with trace residues, and any fluids retained for toxicology. Hospital staff preserved items in sealed evidence bags, noting time, handler, and storage conditions. Because a spouse at this residence is a public figure, a drummer for a nationally recognized rock band, media interest escalated quickly. That attention is context, not proof of anything. Detectives responded by standardizing access: one media point of contact, one case briefing schedule, no leaks. Inside the case room, the priority was sequence discipline. They built a single timeline from verifiable sources: neighbor statements, dispatch timestamps, arrival logs, hospital entries, and the first round of interviews. When investigators say the data align too cleanly, they mean the story must be tested against physics and medicine, not accepted at face value because it sounds organized. Medical legal coordination continued over the next 11 days. Surgeons planned staged operations based on burn depth and infection risk. Each procedure added documentation: vital sign trends, operative notes, tissue condition, and any observation that might clarify the injury mechanism. A core question guided every entry: did the injuries reflect a single-point flare, an accidental spill, or directed liquid contact before ignition? That is not a moral question. It is a pattern question. If seams, cuffs, and protected areas show relative sparing, while exposed regions show consistent depth along a directional path, investigators earn a narrower hypothesis set. If the patterns are inconsistent or blocked by clothing remnants that don't match, the hypothesis broadens. Parallel to the medical file, the investigative team examined communications and movement around the event. Who made the first call for help? At what minute mark? And what wording was used? Who else was present in the residence? And what each person reported seeing, hearing, or smelling? Statements that referenced accident, spill, or flame near clothing were logged without judgment, then cross-referenced to burn geometry and soot distribution at the scene. The point is not to contradict a person. The point is to verify a mechanism. In fatal burn cases, mechanism is the anchor of the eventual charge decision. For viewers who track true crime cases, this is where patience matters. The hospital is not a second crime scene, but it is a critical evidence source. Chain of custody entries from intensive care, bandage changes, removed fabric, trace residues must line up with laboratory results from the home. If those results conflict, the case slows down and testing expands. If they match, the case tightens. Investigators know the cost of getting this wrong. A flawed assumption in week 1 becomes a reversible error in year 3. By the end of the hospital phase, the file included standardized burn maps, toxicology orders, and a consolidated minute-by-minute from the first alarm to the final procedure of the day. Wanda's condition remained critical throughout. The record shows a medical system doing what it can, and a police system building a case the right way, one fact at a time. There is a human reality under all of this. 2 children are now tethered to a timeline that began with a smell of alcohol and a fast-moving flame. The value of careful work here isn't abstract. It will determine how the law describes what happened and how a country remembers it. The third pass through the evidence moved from broad observation to measurable answers. Cause and origin specialists overlaid the scene photographs with the burn maps from the hospital and asked a single question. Do the room's heat signatures and pore paths match the injury distribution on the victim's body? They reshot the residence under controlled light, recording depth of char at set intervals from the floor. Infrared images were paired with color stills to isolate the lowest, hottest burn zones. The pattern was consistent with a rapid surface-level ignition of a liquid fuel, concentrated nearer to the floor and along a short track leading from a central point to a doorway, then stopping at a clean heat edge. From the lab, gas chromatography mass spectrometry returned a clear result. Ethanol, consistent with household use alcohol, was present in multiple swabs from the floor and baseboards. No gasoline-range hydrocarbons were detected. Trace ethanol was also recovered from fabric remnants logged at the hospital. Chain of custody on those items was airtight, sealed at bedside, transferred to evidence storage with time and handler documented, then couriered to the lab. When results from the room and the clothing packet align like this, investigators don't declare intent, they confirm mechanism. The liquid involved was alcohol, not a petroleum product, and it burned fast. Electrical examination found no fault at outlet level or along visible runs. Breakers were intact, wiring insulation undisturbed outside of the flame effect zone, and there was no arc mapping suggestive of an appliance failure. A stove knob tested negative for fresh accelerant trace. It was cataloged, not featured. A cigarette tray and 2 lighters were swabbed. Both lighters carried routine combustion byproducts, but no unique denaturant signatures that could tie them directly to the floor swabs. That doesn't exclude a match or lighter as an ignition source. It says the lab could not prove which one started the flame. Comparative patterning with the victim's burn map narrowed possibilities further. Areas typically protected by seams and thicker fabric showed relative sparing. Exposed regions showed deeper burns along a downward path consistent with splash contact before ignition. Inhalation assessment documented airway involvement compatible with near-field flame, which is common in rapid alcohol burns inside a room that traps heat. The geometry did not read like a localized flare that spreads outward. It read like liquid contact followed by ignition. Again, that conclusion defines how the fire burned, not who lit it. Timeline integration was the next layer. Dispatch records and neighbor statements placed raised voices shortly before the ignition window. Temperature rise and smoke development were fast enough that the call for help followed within minutes. Investigators built a minute-by-minute board from the first complaint to the time the first unit cleared the doorway. Each entry required a document or recording. There is no second scene in this case. The residence remains the single origin, the hospital the source of medical evidence, and the lab the arbiter of what those materials contain. Interviews continued in parallel. Anyone present before or during the ignition was asked to provide a consistent account: where they stood, what they smelled, what sequence they observed. Statements that used the word spill or accident were logged and then tested against the mapped pour path inside the room. If a spill claim placed liquid along a counter, but the highest ethanol concentration sat near the floor by the doorway, that discrepancy went on the board. The rule was simple: align words to physics, not physics to words. One subtle but important point emerged from the char depth grid. At 2 spots along the floor track, char was deeper than the surrounding area by a small, repeatable margin. That's the kind of anomaly that can indicate pooling, a brief hesitation in movement, or a splash that doubled back. The team marked those coordinates for additional swabbing and recheck. If those spots also carried the strongest ethanol signal, the board would record a tighter pore profile. If they didn't, the anomaly could be explained by airflow or surface irregularities. The data aligned too cleanly to ignore, but not so perfectly that it couldn't be wrong. Care is the difference between a strong case and a reversible one. Medical legal coordination produced one more useful artifact: the clothing inventory, including labels that confirmed fabric type. Cotton blends can wick liquid, synthetics can melt and increase burn depth at contact points. The victim's fabric composition tracked with the burn severity charted by surgeons, strengthening the inference of directional liquid exposure. Toxicology was also ordered. In fatal burn cases, it can speak to impairment or defensive capacity at the moment of injury. Those results were pending inside the timeline covered by this segment and would be folded in without speculation. This stage of work is clinical and unglamorous. It is also where many homicide cases lose clarity. Here, the through line stays intact. One residence, a fast alcohol fire, no electrical failure, no second scene, and a clothing trace profile that matches the room's chemistry. Whether that chemistry was present as an accident or by deliberate placement will be the argument later. For now, the file reads like this: measurable, reproducible facts that will not change when memory does. The file advanced when detectives aligned what people did with what the room showed. They built one clock. Every minute had to sit on a document. Neighbor statements with written time notes, the city's dispatch log, first unit arrival and clear times, the burn center's intake sticker. If two sources disagreed, the team didn't average. They paused the conflict until a primary record, radio traffic or hospital registration, could fix it. Neighbors were interviewed one by one. The goal wasn't color, it was sequence. 3 points repeated enough to matter. A heated argument minutes before visible smoke, a sharp alcohol smell in the hallway, and a fast jump from shouting to flames. Those statements were compared against the scene's physics, not the other way around. Investigators pulled the char depth grid at the threshold, the infrared images that showed the hottest regions near the floor, and the lab page that confirmed ethanol in the swabs. The question was simple: do human observations land in the same minutes the room's measurements predict? The emergency call was next. The transcript was short and urgent. It used plain terms: fire, burns, help now, not legal arguments. Timestamps showed the call landing within a narrow window after the last reported shouting. That window matters. A rapid alcohol fire gives little time to act. If the call is placed promptly, it supports a sequence where ignition, recognition, and the attempt to get help came fast. If there had been a long gap, the file would have demanded an explanation. There wasn't one. The clock held. From there, detectives mapped positions. Anyone present in the residence before ignition was asked, on the record, where they were standing, what they saw first, what they touched, and whether they attempted to extinguish flames. Those answers were tested against the room's flow. If a statement placed first smoke at the far wall, the infrared set at that wall was checked for heat concentration. If someone mentioned a dropped container, the photo array taken at floor level by the doorway was reviewed for an object out of place. The narrative did not rest on a single speaker. It had to survive contact with physics, heat signatures, and lab chemistry. The hospital component tightened the clock further. Intake time, first procedure time, first debridement note. These are mechanical entries that anchor the tail end of the sequence. When combined with the fire service's arrival log, they create a bounded interval from last raised voice to documented medical intervention. Within that interval, the burn pattern on the victim's clothing remnants and the room's pour path act like coordinates. The deeper burns align with exposure along a directional track. The ethanol positives from both locations mean the same liquid was in play at the scene and on what the victim wore. None of that proves intent. It proves mechanism and timing. Small inconsistencies were treated as data, not problems to smooth away. One neighbor described the smell before any smoke. Another remembered hearing an object hit the floor. Those details were not forced into one story. They were placed where they fit on the clock and left there until a later test could confirm or invalidate them. The approach is boring to watch in real time and essential in court. When witnesses change phrasing months later, a fixed clock built from records, not memory, protects the case from drifting. Detectives also examined phone activity during the event window. The log showed a short cluster of calls around the ignition period, the call for emergency help and immediate follow-ups to family. No long gap suggested staging. No missing minutes broke the chain. That doesn't tell you why a fire started. It tells you when people acted and whether that action pattern is consistent with a rapid alcohol blaze inside a home. By the end of this phase, the board read clean: raised voices, a rapid ignition, an emergency call within minutes, arrival to a room whose measurements confirm a fast, floor-level burn, transfer to the burn unit, and injury documentation that tracks with directional liquid exposure. No second scene appears anywhere. The hospital remains a source of evidence, not origin. The investigation still holds its line. Define mechanism and sequence first. Reserve conclusions on intent for when all lanes, scene, medical, lab, witness, and timeline lock in the same direction. This is where the work carries weight beyond one file. Cases like this teach a simple rule. If you want the truth to hold in public, it has to hold on paper. Tight clocks, clean chains of custody, and neutral language are not style choices. They are how a community can trust what it is told happened inside a private home. By the fifth day of work, the case stopped feeling like scattered notes and started reading like a clock. Dispatch time, first unit arrival, hospital intake, surgical attempts, and the first complete medical legal packet all sat on the same line. Nothing floated. The ignition window was narrow. The reaction to it was immediate. That sequence matters because prosecutors don't file on instinct. They file when time, mechanism, and medical findings point in one direction. The hospital provided the turning key, formal certification that the injuries were catastrophic thermal burns with airway involvement documented during critical care. After 11 days of treatment, death was recorded on February 21, 2010. With that certificate in the file, the investigation shifted from assault resulting in grievous injury to homicide. In Buenos Aires, that change is procedural, not dramatic. It triggers authority for full forensic consolidation, cause and origin, medical charts, lab chemistry, and sworn statements assembled into one case brief. Detectives tightened the minute by minute. The emergency call fell within minutes of the last reported argument. First responders logged a fast, surface-level burn consistent with liquid alcohol. Lab results confirmed ethanol on the floor track and on clothing remnants. Electrical failure was excluded. The burn map on the victim aligned with directional liquid exposure before ignition. None of those data points alone names intent. Together, they fix mechanism and timing, exactly what a charging memo needs before it talks about motive or state of mind. Statements were brought back against the clock. Accounts that described an accident were not dismissed. They were compared to measurements. If the room shows a concentrated pour path ending at a doorway with clean heat edges, an accidental dispersed spill is hard to maintain. If the injury distribution shows protected seams spared and exposed areas deeply burned along a downward path, a single-point flare is unlikely. The point isn't to argue with a witness. The point is to hold human memory to the same standard as the scene. Phone activity in the event window offered a small but telling check, a rapid call for help and immediate follow-ups to family, with no idle gap suggesting staging. That fact doesn't resolve intent either. It does support a sequence in which ignition, recognition, and attempts to get assistance happen quickly, consistent with a fast alcohol fire in a confined room. The board read clean, no second scene emerged. The hospital remained an evidence source, not origin. The single residence stayed the only place where the event began. With death certified and mechanism stable, prosecutors moved. The charge posture reflected Argentine law, homicide aggravated by the marital relationship. It's a legal framing, not commentary. The aggravator sits on the relationship itself. The underlying cause is the lethal burn mechanism documented by fire science, lab chemistry, and medical records. Preventive measures followed standard steps: custodial status, formalized, interviews preserved, expert notices issued. The file had crossed its threshold. The next phase would not be about how the fire behaved. It would be about accountability under law. These moments are difficult for a community to watch. There's a human loss and 2 children at the center of it, and yet the next chapter has to be as technical as the first. In towns like this, people want answers they can trust. That's why the clock matters. That's why the language stays neutral. It's not style, it's how truth survives a courtroom. 2 years after the fire, the file moved from the lab and interview rooms into a courtroom in Buenos Aires. Trials are about proof, not rumor. The prosecution opened with a clean sequence: a single residence, a rapid alcohol fire on February 10, 2010, transport to a burn unit, and death recorded on February 21st. They told the court they would show a fixed clock, a defined mechanism, and injuries consistent with directional liquid exposure. No images were sensationalized. The narrative lived in documents and sworn testimony. Fire specialists testified first. They described depth of char measurements, infrared imaging of the room, and swabs that later tested positive for ethanol. Electrical faults were excluded. The defense was ready for that testimony and pressed on alternative scenarios: a spill, a flare, a panic. The experts stayed inside the data: floor-level burn concentration ending at a clean heat edge, No evidence of a slow, smoldering origin, and no arc mapping or appliance failure. When asked if the science could determine intent, the answer was precise. It could not. It could only define how the room burned. Medical witnesses followed. Treating clinicians explained airway management, fluid resuscitation, burn mapping by body region, and the photographic record taken for medical legal purposes. The injury distribution was described in non-graphic terms, focusing on pattern and depth. The panel heard why seams and thicker fabrics sometimes show relative sparing and why exposed regions can carry deeper burns when liquid contacts skin before ignition. Again, no one testified to motive. They testified to mechanism and severity. The death certificate closed that lane. Cause: complications from extensive thermal burns. Manner: homicide as charged by the state. Next came the timeline. Dispatch logs, first unit arrival times, and hospital intake stickers were admitted without fanfare. Witnesses from the building testified separately about a brief argument, a strong alcohol odor, and a fast escalation from noise to smoke. Minor differences in phrasing were documented. The sequence held. A call for help was placed within minutes of ignition. The court heard that the residence remained the only origin scene. The hospital was an evidence source, not origin. This mattered because the defense suggested confusion created by chaos. The records provided order the night did not have. The defense case leaned on the doctrine Argentine courts recognize as estado de emoción violenta, violent emotion. In plain terms for English-speaking audiences, it is a mitigating framework that, if accepted, can reduce punishment when a defendant acts under an acute emotional state that impairs self-control. The argument centered on a highly charged relationship moment, stress history, and a claim that the event was an accident or, alternatively, an act without premeditation born from an overwhelming surge of emotion. The defense underscored the immediate call for help and the absence of staging as consistent with panic, not planning. Prosecutors countered by returning to the room. They argued that the mapped pour path and the ethanol match on clothing were not the signatures of a one-point flare. They did not tell the court what to feel. They asked the court to accept what was measured. The state's position was that the mechanism and its timing were inconsistent with a purely accidental scenario, and that the law does not convert every charged argument into mitigation. They noted that emoción violenta does not erase responsibility for a lethal act against a spouse. The panel deliberated on facts and law. When judgment came, it did not mirror the prosecution's entire ask, and it did not ratify the defense wholesale. The court convicted and imposed an 18-year sentence, accepting violent emotion as a mitigating factor in the punishment phase. In their written reasoning, judges referenced the emotional state doctrine and the case context, balancing it against the lethal outcome and the established mechanism of the fire. For the family, for advocates, and for many following the case because of the defendant's public profile, the sentence felt at odds with the severity of the conduct. But in that courtroom on that day, the controlling framework was the doctrine the defense had leaned on throughout. From a case-building perspective, this moment was pivotal. The prosecution had secured a conviction and a substantial term, but the mitigation reduced the penalty below what the state and the victim's family believed the facts warranted. The record, however, was preserved in full. Expert transcripts, exhibits, timelines, and medical certifications. That preservation would matter in the next phase. Appeals are not new trials. They are arguments about how law applied to facts. When a case rests on measurements and records instead of memory and rhetoric, it travels better to the next court. This is where a narrator has to stay disciplined. It would be easy to editorialize. The better service to the audience is clear reporting. A single scene, a defined mechanism, a death certified, and a conviction tempered by a doctrine of violent emotion. Whether that mitigation should have applied would soon move from public debate to a legal question for a higher chamber. Appeals are about law meeting facts already fixed. In September 2013, Argentina's Federal Chamber of Criminal Cassation reviewed the record from start to finish. One residence as the origin, a rapid alcohol fire on February 10, 2010, medical treatment, and a death certificate dated February 21st. The evidence lanes were not relitigated. They were evaluated for legal consequence. The question was narrow. Did the first court misapply emotion violenta when it reduced punishment to 18 years after finding criminal responsibility for a lethal act against a spouse? The state's brief was direct. It argued that the mechanism, ethanol-confirmed burn path, electrical exclusion, injury distribution consistent with directional liquid exposure, did not support mitigation premised on an uncontrollable emotional storm. Prosecutors emphasized that emotion violenta is exceptional, not routine, and must be anchored to proof that the defendant's capacity was acutely overwhelmed in a way the facts can sustain. The state also pointed to the relationship aggravator in the penal code, noting that lethal violence inside a domestic setting is expressly weighted by law. Defense counsel responded that the trial court had already balanced these factors and that panic and immediate calls for help were consistent with a mind in crisis, not a plan. They asked the chamber to respect the trial court's discretion at sentencing, arguing that intensity of emotion, however brief, was recognized by Argentine jurisprudence and had been properly considered. Cassation judges returned to the record, not the headlines. They identified what was uncontested: single-scene origin in the home, rapid ignition of liquid alcohol, absence of an alternative electrical cause, tight emergency timeline, and the medical chain that ended in death after 11 days. From there, the chamber assessed whether those facts fit the legal elements for mitigation. The answer was no. The ruling held that the evidentiary picture was incompatible with a sentencing reduction based on emotion violenta. The doctrine, the court wrote, could not be used to discount responsibility in a homicide aggravated by the marital bond when the proven mechanism and sequence pointed the opposite way. The sentence was increased to prisión perpetua, life imprisonment, for homicide aggravated by the relationship. No second ending exists after this date in credible records. This appellate outcome is the controlling legal resolution. For the family and for a public long focused on this case because of the defendant's profile, the ruling did not rewrite the physics of the fire. It clarified what those measurements mean under law when a spouse dies from directed burn injuries inside a home. This is the moment to keep the narration disciplined. The chamber did not speculate about motive beyond what the record allowed. It applied statute to an established sequence. The case's spine remains intact across all chapters. One scene, one mechanism, one certified death, one final sentence. The file moved from investigation to verdict to review, and at review, it settled. Argentina did not move on from this case when the courtroom emptied. It changed the way people talked about lethal violence at home. Newsrooms and advocacy groups stopped leaning on the easy phrase crime of passion and began naming what the record showed: the killing of a woman by an intimate partner, femicide. Language didn't bring anyone back, but it aligned headlines with facts and made policy conversations more honest. When terms get precise, complacency has fewer places to hide. There was another shift, a public warning about method. After the fire that killed Wanda Tati, reports described copycat attacks using alcohol and flame, what commentators called the Wanda effect. Responsible outlets learned to cover means without telegraphing how to. Programs tightened editorial standards, focus on risk factors, accountability, and survivor pathways, not techniques. It's a small editorial choice with real-world stakes. The law also recalibrated in the only way it can, through outcomes anchored to evidence. In 2013, the Cassation Court set aside mitigation and imposed life imprisonment for homicide aggravated by the marital relationship. One scene, one mechanism, one final sentence. Keeping those three pillars consistent protects the public from rumor and protects victims from being turned into narrative devices. Her parents, Beatrice Regal and Jorge Tade, refused to let the case become just a headline. They built the kind of outreach that doesn't make noise for a week and disappear. Schools, faith communities, universities, wherever they were invited, they brought a simple message that works in any language. People who love do not kill. Their talks are not courtroom reenactments. They are checklists for prevention. Recognize escalation, take threats seriously, document incidents, ask for help before injuries are the proof. The butterfly keeps appearing in their materials and at home, not as decoration, but as a private signal that breath returned, however briefly, and that memory will not be negotiated away. There is a community responsibility here too. Friends and neighbors who hear volatility and smell risk often feel it is not their place to act. Cases like this argue the opposite. Calling for help, logging what you saw and when, saving a text that shows escalation. These are small acts that later become the backbone of proof. They also interrupt harm. A knock on a door, a second witness, a ride to a safe place. Modest steps carry more weight than speeches after a funeral. For shows like ours, the obligation is clarity. Tell the story once, accurately, without alternate endings. Hold to documents more than memory. Avoid the sugar high of speculation. Focus on what helps a viewer think. The early red flags in a volatile home, the speed of alcohol fires in confined spaces, the reality that an immediate call can save a life, but cannot always undo a cause already set in motion. When we keep the spine straight, scene, mechanism, certified death, legal resolution, we leave fewer gaps for confusion to grow. As for meaning, it is not complicated. Wanda Tade, 29, was a mother of two. She died after 11 days of treatment that could not reverse the damage from a fire set inside her home in Buenos Aires. Courts first punished, and then, on review, punished fully. The sentence stands. The legacy belongs to the living, the families who now teach prevention, the reporters who choose accurate words, the viewers who learn to act when something sounds wrong through the wall. If you are watching and wondering what to do with this story, make it practical. Learn the local numbers for emergency help and counseling. If you see someone spiraling, offer a ride, a couch, or a call. If you are in danger, document what you can and reach out, quietly if you must, publicly if you can. Precision saved this case from becoming rumor. It can also save a life before a headline exists. I've learned one thing telling cases like Wanda's. Truth sticks when we build it on records, and safety grows when we act early. If a friend's situation feels off, don't wait. Document, check in, offer a ride, call for help. Love never requires fear. As a community, we can choose precise language, stand with survivors, and push for accountability without sensationalizing pain. What did this story change for you? Did it challenge how you see private arguments at home? Drop a comment. Share where you're watching from. If this resonated, or even if it didn't, tell me why and subscribe for the next case.